Yul Brynner sat in his canvas chair, perfectly still, watching the studio executive humiliate his makeup artist with a volume that carried across the entire soundstage. 1962, MGM Lot, Stage 7, Day 4 of Kings of the Sun production, 47 degrees in the early morning shadows, and Harold Weinstock was making sure everyone knew he owned everything they could see. The makeup artist, Maria Santos, was 62 years old. She'd worked every major picture since 1934. She'd painted Gable's mustache, powdered Garbo's nose, and made Bogart look 20 years younger in his final films. Today, she was apparently not working fast enough for a man who'd never held a makeup brush in his life. "This is unacceptable," Weinstock's voice boomed across the set, cutting through the usual morning preparation sounds. "I don't care if you've been here since Christ was a carpenter. My picture, my schedule, my money." He leaned over Maria's station, invading her space, making her hands tremble as she tried to work on a supporting actor's foundation. "You understand English? Because you're moving like you don't." The comment landed like a slap. Maria was Mexican-American, had been in this country for 40 years, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had earned more respect in Hollywood than most directors ever would. But Weinstock didn't care about any of that. He cared about feeling important, about making sure everyone knew he could destroy careers with a phone call. 20 feet away, Yul Brynner observed the interaction with the same stillness he brought to everything. No expression, no movement, just those dark eyes recording every detail. He'd been sitting in makeup for 30 minutes, letting Maria work her magic, listening to her stories about the old days, treating her with the respect she'd earned. Now he was watching that respect get trampled by a man who confused money with worth. The supporting actor in Maria's chair, a young method actor named Jimmy Kowalski, shifted uncomfortably. He'd worked 3 pictures, was grateful to be here, and didn't want to make waves. But even he could see this wasn't right. Maria's hands were shaking now, and when your hands shake, you can't do precise work. When you can't do precise work, you make mistakes. When you make mistakes, men like Weinstock get louder. "Maybe," Jimmy said quietly, "if we gave her a minute." "Who asked you?" Weinstock snapped. "You're what, 25? Been in this business 5 minutes? Keep your mouth shut and let the adults handle adult situations." Maria dropped her powder brush. It hit the floor with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo in the sudden silence. She bent to pick it up, and for a moment, her composure cracked, her shoulders sagged. 40 years of dignity, and this was how she was being treated. That's when Yul Brynner spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly enough that his voice carried exactly as far as it needed to. "Mr. Weinstock." The executive turned, probably expecting support from the star, some acknowledgement of his authority. Instead, he found himself looking at a man who had learned command in places where volume meant nothing, and presence meant everything. Yul stood slowly, deliberately, the way a king might rise from a throne. No hurry, no drama, just the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "This set belongs to everyone who works here. Everyone who earns their place here. Everyone who shows respect for the work." His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Maria has been making actors look like heroes since before either of us arrived. She has earned more respect in 1 day than some people earn in a lifetime." Weinstock's face flushed. He was not used to being challenged, especially not in front of crew members, especially not by actors who were supposed to follow his lead. "Now look here, Brynner. I don't know how things work in your world, but this is my picture, my budget, your budget," Yul interrupted, still speaking quietly, "pays for professional work. Professional work requires professional treatment. You are not providing that." The soundstage had gone completely quiet. Even the grips had stopped moving equipment. The script supervisor had stopped turning pages. The assistant director had stopped checking his watch. Everyone was watching this moment unfold, sensing that something fundamental was being decided. Weinstock took a step closer to Yul, using his height advantage. He was maybe 2 inches taller, and his position. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but I know exactly who I am," Yul said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more dangerous in its quietness. "I am someone who has worked with professionals for 20 years. I am someone who understands the difference between authority and bullying. And I am someone who will not watch good people be humiliated for your entertainment." The executive opened his mouth, probably to assert his power, to remind everyone about money and hierarchy and who signed the checks. But Yul wasn't finished. "This set belongs to everyone who earns their place here through their work, their skill, their contribution. It belongs to Maria, who has forgotten more about filmmaking than most people will ever learn. It belongs to Jimmy, who shows up prepared and ready to work. It belongs to every person here who treats this job with the respect it deserves." He took one step closer to Weinstock, just one step. But it changed everything. Suddenly, the height difference didn't matter. Suddenly, the title on the door didn't matter. Suddenly, the only thing that mattered was presence, and Yul Brynner had more of it than anyone in that room had ever seen. "What it does not belong to," he continued, his voice now carrying an edge that could cut glass, "is someone who mistakes cruelty for leadership. Someone who believes that humiliating others makes him more important. Someone who has confused his position with his value." The silence was total now, complete. Jimmy Kowalski would remember it 40 years later as the most electric moment he ever witnessed on a film set. Maria had stopped shaking. The grips had stopped breathing. And Harold Weinstock was discovering that all his power meant nothing when faced with someone who simply refused to be impressed by it. "If you speak to Maria that way again," Yul said, his voice barely above a whisper now but somehow carrying to every corner of the soundstage, "if you treat any member of this crew with disrespect again, you will leave this set. Not tomorrow, not later today, immediately, and you will not return." Weinstock's face went through several colors. Red from anger, white from shock, then a sort of gray from the realization that he was facing something he couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, couldn't control. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a discussion. This was a statement of fact being delivered by someone who had the absolute confidence to enforce it. "You can't," Weinstock started. "I can," Yul said simply, "because this set, while you're on it, operates on respect. Real respect. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you earn. You have not earned it. You have not even tried to earn it. And until you do, you are a guest here. Guests who cannot behave properly are asked to leave." The executive looked around the set, perhaps expecting support, perhaps looking for allies. But every face was either neutral or openly supportive of Yul. The crew had been waiting for someone to say what needed to be said, and now it had been said. Not with shouting, not with threats, not with dramatics. With simple, quiet certainty. "This is ridiculous," Weinstock muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just an actor. I own this production." "You finance this production," Yul corrected. "You do not own the people who make it. And people who cannot be owned cannot be intimidated." He straightened his shoulders and somehow seemed to grow taller without moving. "Maria, please continue with your work. Take all the time you need. Excellence cannot be rushed." He turned back to his chair, sat down, and closed his eyes as Maria resumed applying his makeup. Her hands were steady now. Her dignity was intact. And Harold Weinstock was standing in the middle of a soundstage, where his power had just been quietly, completely, publicly dismantled. The executive stood there for another 30 seconds, perhaps trying to think of a comeback, perhaps trying to salvage his authority. But there was nothing to salvage. He had been exposed not as evil or cruel, but as something worse in Hollywood, irrelevant. His money could buy equipment and salaries, but it couldn't buy respect. And without respect, all the money in the world was just numbers on paper. Weinstock left the soundstage without another word. He returned the next day and the day after that, but something fundamental had changed. He spoke more quietly. He asked instead of demanded. He said please and thank you to crew members whose names he had never bothered to learn. Not because he had suddenly become a better person, but because he had learned that his authority only extended as far as people were willing to recognize it. And people weren't willing to recognize authority that wasn't backed by character. The story spread, as stories do in Hollywood, not as gossip, but as legend. The day Yul Brynner faced down a studio executive not with threats or contracts or agents, but with simple, unshakable dignity. The day someone proved that real power isn't about what you can do to people, but about who you are when people are watching. Jimmy Kowalski, the young supporting actor, went on to have a decent career. Nothing spectacular, but steady work for 30 years. In 1995, he was interviewed for a documentary about classic Hollywood. The interviewer asked about his most memorable moment on a film set. Yul Brynner and the studio boss on Kings of the Sun, Jimmy said without hesitation. I'd never seen anything like it. This executive was screaming at our makeup artist, this lovely woman who'd been in the business forever, really degrading stuff, and YUL just stood up. Didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anybody, didn't mention lawyers or agents or any of that Hollywood stuff. Jimmy paused, choosing his words carefully. He just explained how things were going to be, like he was stating a fact about gravity or mathematics. Not negotiable, not arguable, just reality. And somehow, everyone in that room, including the guy with all the money, understood that this was reality, that YUL wasn't bluffing or posturing. He was just explaining how respect works. The interviewer asked what happened to the executive. He came back the next day like a different person. Polite, professional, almost deferential. I think that moment taught him something about the difference between power and authority. Power is what people give you. Authority is what you earn. And you can't fake authority, you can't buy it, you can't threaten your way into it. Jimmy smiled. YUL had it. Real authority. The kind that makes you want to be better just by being around it. Maria Santos worked in Hollywood until 1978, retiring at age 78 after a career that spanned 5 decades and hundreds of films. In her retirement interview, a reporter asked about her most memorable day on set. The day Yul Brynner stood up for me, she said immediately, not because I couldn't stand up for myself. I'd been doing that for 40 years. But because he understood that some fights aren't about winning or losing. They're about what kind of place you want to work in, what kind of people you want to be around. She looked thoughtful. That executive, Mr. Weinstock, he wasn't a bad man. He was just confused about what made him important. He thought it was his money, his title, his position. YUL showed him it was his character. And once Mr. Weinstock understood that, he became someone you could actually work with. Harold Weinstock continued as a studio executive until his retirement in 1981. Colleagues from his later years described him as demanding but fair, someone who pushed for excellence but never forgot that films were made by people, not machines. When he died in 1989, his obituary mentioned his contribution to several classic films, but friends remembered him more for his evolution as a leader. At his funeral, Maria Santos was among the mourners. She told Weinstock's widow that her husband had become one of the most respected executives she'd ever worked with, someone who understood that authority and cruelty were not the same thing, and that the best work came from environments built on mutual respect. He learned that lesson late, she said, but he learned it completely, and he never forgot it. Yul Brynner himself never spoke publicly about the incident. But in 1983, a journalist asked him about leadership, about the difference between commanding presence and commanding authority. True authority, YUL said, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. People recognize it instinctively because it's based on something real. Competence, integrity, respect for others. False authority is loud because it has to be. It's constantly proving itself, Because deep down, everyone knows it's not real. He paused. In any group of people, the real leader is usually the one who serves others, not the one who expects to be served. The one who lifts others up, not the one who pushes others down. This isn't about being nice or soft. It's about understanding that respect can't be demanded. It can only be earned, and earning it requires character, not just position. The journalist asked if he'd ever had to confront someone in authority who didn't understand this distinction. Yul smiled slightly. Once or twice. But I've found that most people, when given the choice between respect and fear, will choose respect. They just need someone to show them the difference. And once they see it, they usually prefer it. Fear is exhausting to maintain. Respect is energizing to earn. This story reminds us that real power isn't about what you can make people do. It's about who you choose to be when you have the choice between building others up or tearing them down. Harold Weinstock had positional authority that day on stage 7. Yul Brynner had moral authority, and in the end, moral authority proved stronger, more lasting, and more transformative. Because at the end of the day, people don't remember how much money you had or what title was on your door. They remember how you treated them when you thought nobody was watching. And sometimes, everyone is watching, waiting for someone to show them what dignity looks like in action.